Hello, my name is Randall Horton, and welcome to Arts UNH, where we talk with poets, writers, and visual artists that will be reading and or lecturing on the campus of the University of New Haven. We would like to thank the College of Arts and Science for making these short segments possible. Through the course of these interviews, we hope that our audience will get to know writers and their work, but most importantly, we hope to contribute to the discourse of the creativity within the arts. Tonight, our special guest is Martin Espada, and I'll just read you his bio. Called the Latino poet of his generation, Martin Espada was born in Brooklyn, New York. He has published more than 15 books as a poet, editor, essayist, and translator. His latest collection of poems, The Trouble Ball, Norton 2011, is the recipient of the Milt Kessler Award, a Massachusetts Book Award, and an International Latino Book Award. The Republic of Poetry, a collection published by Norton in 2006, received the Paterson Award for Sustained Literary Achievement and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. A previous book of poems, Imagine the Angels of Bread, Norton 1996, won an American Book Award and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. He has received such recognition as the Robert Creeley Award, the National Hispanic Cultural Center Literacy Award, the Penn Revison Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. His work has been widely translated. Collections of poems have been published in Spain, Puerto Rico, and Chile. Espada is currently a professor in the Department of English at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Welcome, Martin. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Randall.
All right. So, first of all, I want to place our conversation within the context of one of your essays called Zapata Disciples and Perfect Brie, in which you mention your father being arrested in Biloxi, Mississippi for not going to the back of the bus. You examine his social class in direct relation to the opportunities denied because of racism. Now, I would like to quote here, if I may, what you write: his experiences, the frustrations and rages, the stubborn resistance, the dignity of his defiance formed the environment in which I evolved as son, poet, contributing to my awareness of class and its punishments. For me, I think this quote becomes emblematic of the poetry that I see you engaging in, and most specifically, your latest collection, The Trouble Ball. Can you talk a little bit about your influence of being a product of your father's social class? And I'm thinking about the list of jobs you had along the way to become a poet that we know today, in terms of bouncer, you was a lawyer, you've done, cook, dishwasher. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, first of all, in terms of the social class into which I was born, it must be said that I was born in the East New York section of Brooklyn, which is one of the very few ungentrified sections of Brooklyn left in that borough, I'm proud to say. And I grew up there in the Linden Projects, working class projects, working people for the most part. And my father was one of those. When I was born, he was working as a draftsman for an electrical contracting company and hating it. What he really wanted to do is be a photographer, and indeed that's what he ultimately did. But along the way, both before and after I came along, my father was an activist. He was one of the leaders of the Puerto Rican community in New York City during the 1960s and into the 70s. And that was a community of almost 1 million people. Some people say he was the leader of that community. And it did begin for him in Biloxi, Mississippi in December of 1949, when my father, Frank Espada, was arrested and jailed for not going to the back of the bus. And we tend to forget all too easily what kind of sacrifices and punishments the previous generation endured. Very easy to forget, because they resisted, and because they organized, and because they made changes, and because so many of those ugly symbols of racist thought and racist ideology are no longer with us on a daily basis. So my father went through that trial by fire.
Right. Oh, yeah. I mean, I can definitely relate to that because my father, I look at my father in the same way coming from Birmingham, Alabama, growing up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and he certainly had to endure a lot of that. So, yeah. Now, getting back to the book, the opening poem, which is titled The Trouble Ball, is sort of I like to call a backstory that helps to inform the book. I'd like to ask if you would mind reading that poem, The Trouble Ball, and then actually talking about how does that poem sort of inform, the work that you're doing within this collection.
Now, do you want me to tell people about all the characters and history?
Well, no, I just want you to set it up because I know.
Or do you want to tell them about that?
Well, I know it's sort of, set up in terms of Satchel Paige.
Who was that?
Satchel Paige was an African American pitcher who didn't make it to the big leagues too much later in his life, but he was a star, huge star within the Negro Leagues. And if I'm not mistaken, he might not have made it to the big leagues till he was in his late 40s, because no one really knew his age. Mm-hmm. But he was legendary in terms of his pitching within those communities. And actually, when I saw the poem, I actually didn't know about this. Him going over to Puerto Rico. Am I correct? Right.
That's right.
Right. I didn't know that. Yeah. That's the part of the history that I didn't know, and that's the beautiful thing about poems. They can teach you stuff every day. Uh-huh. And so, Satchel Paige was known for these balls that he threw. I can't remember all of them, but I think the trouble ball, if I'm not mistaken, was one of those pitches.
Mm-hmm. It was his changeup.
Changeup, right. And so I think the trouble ball becomes an interesting metaphor for the book, too.
Trouble.
Trouble.
Yeah.
And
Well, we tend to forget. I mean, one of the themes of the book is the struggle between memory and forgetting.
Right.
Individually and historically.
Okay.
And we've already forgotten so much. We're talking now about things that happened in the 1940s.
Right.
And yet, you may be aware of this, there are young people born after 9/11 who don't know what happened on that date. That's how it works. So you can imagine how much has been forgotten since, say, 1941, exactly. Which is when the action of the poem begins.
Right.
Actually, I'll take us back a little bit further than that. My father, Frank Espada, was born in Utuado, Puerto Rico in 1930. Okay. And from the beginning, almost, my father loved baseball. And throughout the decade of the 30s, my father and his father would watch every game they could on the island of Puerto Rico, mm-hmm. Particularly the games involving the stars from the Negro Leagues, okay. Who would barnstorm, right. Or even, in the case of Satchel Paige, for example, join Puerto Rican teams in the winter leagues. Satchel Paige took it a step further. He married a Puerto Rican woman. He loved it there. Right. And he was welcomed there like a minor deity. This despite the fact that at the same time, Satchel Paige and other African-American stars of the Negro Leagues, as you know, mm-hmm. were prohibited from playing baseball in the major leagues. Right. Well, when my father was 11, he moved with his family to Brooklyn, New York. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things he did with his father was to go to a baseball game at Ebbets Field. Now, we currently associate Ebbets Field and Jackie Robinson with progress.
Exactly.
With change, right. Breaking the color line. Yeah. That did not happen until 1947. Right. So, in 1941, 6 years earlier, Ebbets Field and the Brooklyn Dodgers were just as segregated as any other ballpark or team in Major League Baseball. And that's what sets the stage for my father's loss of innocence, one of many. I think mm-hmm. we talk about loss of innocence. Right. You lose your innocence many times. Right. Yeah. And this was the first of many times that he would lose his innocence. So, and I have this water here because mm-hmm. what I'm about to read is like an epic. It's like the length of a Bible. It's like Beowulf.
Right. We certainly appreciate it.
Yeah. So, the trouble ball becomes a metaphor. As I mentioned, on the most literal level, it refers to Satchel Paige's changeup, mm-hmm. his slowest pitch. But here it addresses the big trouble, the trouble of race in this country. The Trouble Ball from my father, Frank Espada. In 1941, my father saw his first big league ball game at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, the Dodgers and the Cardinals. My father took his father's hand. When the umpires lumbered on the field, the band in the stands with the bass drum and trombone struck up a chorus of Three Blind Mice. The peanut vendor shook a cowbell and hollered. The home team raced across the diamond, and 30,000 people shouted all at once as if an army of liberation rolled down Bedford Avenue. My father shouted too. He wanted to see the Trouble Ball. On my father's island, there were hurricanes and tuberculosis, dissidents in jail, and baseball. The loudspeakers boomed. Satchel Paige pitching for the Burjos of Guayama. From the Negro Leagues, he brought the gifts of Balthasar the King. From a bench on the plaza, he told the secrets of 1,000 pitches. The Trouble Ball, the Triple Curve, the Bat Dodger, the Midnight Creeper, the Slow Gin Fizz, the Thoughtful Stuff. Pancho Coimbra hit rainmakers for the Leones of Ponce. Satchel sat the outfielders in the grass to play poker, windmilled 3 pitches to the plate, and Pancho spun around 3 times. He couldn't hit the Trouble Ball. At Ebbets Field, the first pitch echoed in the mitt of Mickey Owen, the catcher for the Dodgers, who never let the ball escape his glove. A boy off the boat. My father shelled peanuts, waiting for Satchel Paige to steer his gold Cadillac from the bullpen to the mound just as he would navigate the streets of Guayama. Yet Satchel never tipped his cap that day. ¿Dónde están los negros? Asked the boy. Where are the Negro players? No los dejan, his father softly said. They don't let them play here. Mickey Owen would never have to dive for the Trouble Ball. It was then that the only brown boy at Ebbets Field felt himself levitate above the grandstand and the diamond, another banner at the ball game. From up high, he could see that everyone was white, and their whiteness was impossible, like snow in Puerto Rico, and just as silent. So he could not hear the cowbell or the trombone or the Dodger fans howling with glee at the bases loaded double. He understood why his father whispered in Spanish. Everybody in the stands might overhear the secret of the Trouble Ball. At Ebbets Field in 1941, the Dodgers met the Yankees in the World Series. Mickey Owen dropped the 3rd strike with 2 outs in the 9th inning of Game 4, flailing like a lobster in the grip of a laughing fisherman, and the Yankees stamped their spikes across the plate to win. Brooklyn, the borough of churches, prayed for his fumbling soul. This was the reason statues of the Virgin leaked tears and the fathers of Brooklyn drank, not the banishment of Satchel Paige's double headers in Bismarck, North Dakota. There were no rosaries or Boilermakers for the Trouble Ball. My father would return to baseball on 108th Street. He pitched for the Crusaders, kicking high like Satchel, riding the team bus painted with 4-leaf clovers, seasick all the way to Hackensack or the Brooklyn Parade Grounds. One day he jammed his wrist sliding into second, threw 3 more innings anyway, and never pitched again. He would return to Ebbets Field to court my mother. The same year they were married, a waiter refused to serve them, a mixed couple sitting all night in the corner, till my father hoisted him by his lapels, and the waiter's feet dangled in the air, a puppet and his furious puppeteer. My father was familiar with the Trouble Ball. I was born in Brooklyn in 1957, when the Dodgers packed their duffel bags and left the city. A wrecking ball swung an uppercut into the face of Ebbets Field. I heard the stories, and my mother, lost in the circles and diamonds of her scorecard, never saw Jackie Robinson accelerate down the line to steal home. I wore my father's glove until the day I laid it down to lap the water from the fountain in the park. By the time I raised my head, it was gone like Ebbets Field. I walked slowly home. I had to tell my father I would never learn to catch the trouble ball. There was a sign below the scoreboard at Ebbets Field. Abe Stark, Brooklyn's leading clothier. Hit sign, windsuit. Some people see that sign in dreams. They speak of ballparks as cathedrals, frame the pennants from the game where it began, Dodger blue and Cardinal red, and gaze upon the wall. My father, who remembers everything, remembers nothing of that dazzling day but this. ¿Dónde están los negros? No los dejan. His hair is white, and still the words are there, like the ghostly imprint of stitches on the forehead from a pitch that got away. It is forever 1941. It was the trouble ball.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, so what I wanted to ask you was this project, the Trouble Ball, was it something that you were thinking about immediately after the collection that you were writing, that you wrote, excuse me, I apologize, the Republic of Poetry, which, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and actually probably was my Pulitzer that year.
Thank you for saying that.
No, seriously. I really thought this was a great book. That was a great book. I love the Trouble Ball too, but I'm just going to tell you, for me, the Republic of Poetry just opened up so many possibilities. I appreciated the history, and I just wanted to know, was this something coming out of that more concentrated look at the Chilean government that you were doing, and then coming to this? Was this something that you welcomed to come out of that, that project of the Republic of Poetry, or was this something that sort of had been sort of manifesting itself, through the years in terms of the Trouble Ball?
Well, I think in some ways this book is a return to earlier roots and earlier preoccupations and obsessions. In some ways, the first section of the book resembles Imagine the Angels of Bread, which I published way back in 1996, in that it mines an autobiographical vein,
right,
which has to begin necessarily with my father. But there are also poems about me growing up in Brooklyn, poems about me emulating my hero, the lightweight champion of the world, Carlos Ortiz, Puerto Rican boxer. Poems about me trying to figure out my own identity in Brooklyn, which was often formed through a punch in the face.
Right.
There are a couple of Chile poems in this book. I sort of left over from my focus on Chile and the Republic of Poetry, and also based on my second visit to Chile in 2007.
Okay.
And then there are a number of elegies. Just a bunch of my friends started dying.
Right.
And that happens after the age of 50. They start dropping.
We talked about that.
And so there are a bunch of elegies. And I had friends and mentors who were well up in age. My great friend Howard Zinn, my great friend Abe Oshraf, my great friend Adrian Mitchell, are only three to whom
You're right. And I actually had
dedicated.
noted that, and I was actually thinking about Curbstone Press, Sandy Taylor. And, for those who don't know, how influential was Curbstone Press to the development of Martin Espada?
Well, I think Curbstone Press rescued me from the wilderness, basically. I had published 2 books before Curbstone. No one read them. And then I published with Curbstone in 1990 a book called Rebellion is a Circle of a Lover's Hands. And then people said, who's this guy?
Right.
Because Curbstone was the little engine that could. They had tremendous energy. And did what so many small presses cannot do. They were able to promote and distribute their books, thanks largely to Sandy Taylor, who was a whirlwind. You know,
they did good work, and I'm thinking of the last one probably that they published was Araceli Skirmay's book, if I'm not mistaken. Or, well, maybe a couple of more, because I know they went to Tri-County Northwestern. They took them under their umbrella, and so they're actually still doing some things. I don't know if they've come up with recently.
Well, Northwestern carries the inventory, so the books I published are still in print. I believe Naomi Ayala might have been the last poet to publish a book with Curbstone. But Curbstone was a community. It's much more than a publisher or a small
I
press.
got the sense of the poets that I talked to, Ethelbert Miller talks about, that experience as well.
Yeah, no, it was remarkable. For me, Curbstone was my city lights.
Right.
And the little factory town where they were based, Willimantic, Connecticut, formerly known as Thread City for the thread mills there, became my San Francisco.
Okay.
So I wrote an elegy for Sandy, which is in this book, and I can read that one if you like.
Okay. Yeah, I want to hold that one to the end. I want to ask you one question, and then we can end on that poem, but I think it'd be apropos.
It's fine.
And this is a little interesting. I've been thinking about identity. We talk about these things, and I'm coming from the African American community. There's always this issue about oneself and dealing with race, and how does one deal with that within one's own poetics. And so what I go back to for me is I go back to Langston Hughes' Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain. So I have this question for you. So it's been said that you are the Latino poet of our generation, and I have to concur, considering the great amount of work that you've compiled along with mentorship and influence you've done within the Latino community. Now, with that in mind, I'm thinking about Langston Hughes, like I said, essays, The Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain. How would you say, how real would you say the racial mountain is within the Latino community, or does it even exist in another form? In terms, I know it's a little loaded, but I'm just interested in. We talk about these, these parallelisms in terms of what writers deal with in terms of confronting race and identity within one's own self. And I know sometimes, coming from within the African American community, this becomes an issue sometimes with writers. Who may be struggling with identity, maybe struggling with a voice, and not necessarily getting mentorship. So these things are real.
Well, I'll say this first of all, that for Latino writers, I believe that there is not only a racial mountain, there's a racial mountain range.
Okay.
There's a mountain, and there's another mountain, and another mountain, and another mountain.
Right.
Look, it's undulating like a sea monster.
Yeah.
And that is because of the enormous complexity and the contradictions of race among Latinos. Speaking just for Puerto Ricans, for example, in terms of being a combination of the Spanish and the African and the indigenous Tainos blending together over 500 years in all kinds of ways, some ways violent and in other ways and not. But inevitably creating a new human being.
Right.
And so we don't fit into the neatly preconceived racial categories that this country has settled into simplistically. As you well know, there are historians who think strictly in terms of poles in black and white.
That's what I'm saying, yeah. And I find it fascinating. I didn't even know that until, a few years ago, that, a lot of my Latino friends are classified as white, and they live their lives, totally opposite from that existence. And so, we get in these categorizations, and that's, I think, part of the problem that we have in terms of, our society.
Well, as we were discussing earlier, my father was arrested and thrown into jail in Mississippi for not going to the back of the bus. Clearly, he was defined as a person of color, as we would say now. They didn't call him that.
They didn't use black or white, because I'm from down that way in Alabama, and it was really black or white. That's what
and I remember when I talked to my father about that, I said, "Were you surprised?" He said, "Not really. I'd been called the N-word by the cops before."
Right.
So, and now if I were to put myself in that box called white, I would be denying my father. I would be denying his heritage and his suffering and his sacrifice. I would be trying to pass, and I think that's unethical.
Yeah, exactly.
And so in my work, I try to concentrate on telling those stories, his stories, but to go beyond that, to go beyond questions of identity, because I think if you go to questions of identity and remain stuck there, that you don't mature as a person and you don't mature as a poet.
Exactly.
And after a while, it becomes an obsession, not unlike what we see very young people going through on a personal level. So yes, there's a racial mountain range, and we have to climb it, and then we also have to find other places.
Right.
I'm paraphrasing now, but I believe it was Malcolm X who said, if you need a revolution and you want to know who your allies are going to be, just look around you for the other people who also need a revolution.
Right.
You know, and he understood that
Right.
level of solidarity.
Yeah.
And whereas over the years, politically, Latinos and African Americans have often been forced to fight over the lion's share of the crumbs.
Right.
My father, politically, when he was working in Brooklyn in the 60s and 70s, deliberately set up coalitions with African American leaders in Brooklyn in the 60s, like Al Vann, like Major Owens. My father had experience in the civil rights movement, and that's what led him to that orientation. Going all the way back to Mississippi, what did that tell him? It told him he had more in common than not with the ones who were being subjected
Right.
to Jim Crow segregation in the South.
Exactly.
And he took that lesson with him, and he passed it along to me, and that's where it turns up in my writing.
Well, we thank your father. Can you read us that poem by Sandy, and so we can close out? We want to thank you again for coming and spending time with us, and we look forward to the reading tonight for sure.
Well, thank you very much. And I will preface this poem in two ways. One is to say that this is a true story because it sounds unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is to say that this all took place in Willimantic, Connecticut, a year after Sandy died. The setting for the poem is a place known as Julia de Burgos Park, named for the Puerto Rican poet, and created as a poet's park where Curbstone poets and others could gather and read on a regular basis, and they still do.
Okay, cool.
So, this poem is called The Day We Buried You in the Park, for Alexander Sandy Taylor. And there is an epigraph. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. Walt Whitman. The day we buried you in the park, I couldn't say no. Your wife had a plan revealed on the phone with the hush of conspiracy. There are laws in this city against the interment of human remains in public spaces. This was the Poets' Park, your vision floating like the black butterflies of cinders over the house in ruins across the street. You and Juan saw the stone steps flowing down into the circle where the poets would stand and sing one day. You and Juan saw the poets showering the air with words and the trees drinking words like water. You nailed up the sign and spread your arms to greet us at the ceremony. This could not be explained to the clerk who stamps the licenses for the burial of the dead. Juan began to cry when he saw your ashes in the wheelbarrow. I shook him by the shoulder. The neighbor who watches the park from her window was eyeing us. I handed him the shovel. We had to clamp our jaws like mobsters, stoically soiling their hands with the grit of a rival thug. Your wife poured a bag of plant food over your ashes in case the neighbor peeked too long through the hedges or the cops rolled their cruiser to a stop, bored after years of shoving drunks into the back seat. We stirred the ashes with our hands till they turned white at the wrist, and what I had heard was true. There's bone that will not burn, bodies that refuse to become dust, the stubborn shards of a man. Ask any criminal who labors to bury the evidence. We weren't criminals. We dug the hole in the wrong place, ripped out the roots, grunted with every shovel full of rocks. We made the little grave too big, then tossed away the dirt, forgetting that we'd need to fill the hole once we dumped you in it. When I tipped the wheelbarrow, your ashes landed with a puff, drifting in the briefest of clouds over the grass, and Juan dropped to his knees, crying again, giving us away. The neighbor poked her head from the window like a chicken suspicious of the world beyond the coop. An hour After we began, I wore a mask of ash and sweat, black shoes white, like the last man in the village to hear the warning of volcano, or a miner on the first day back at work after the strike is lost, or a believer smeared with his ancestors about to wash in the great river. A woman who recognized my face stopped me as I crossed the street. "Did you just bury something in the park?" she asked. "Why would I do a thing like that?" I said. "The day we buried you in the park, I drove home with 3 scoops of your ashes in a coffee can, chock full of nuts, the heavenly coffee, their slogan emblazoned in a cloud across the New York skyline. At your desk, there was bad coffee and good poetry, but no heaven, so I will look for you under my boot soles, walking through the world, soaking up the ghosts wherever I may go."
Amazing. Wow. We would like to thank you for watching Arts UNH tonight with our special guest, Martin Espada. Please tune in and check out our website for the next installment, where our guest will be Margaret Boland, artist and painter, where we're exhibiting her artwork in the Seton Gallery. She does these wonderful paintings of African-American girls in whiteface. Very interesting narratives. Again, RCUNH is made possible through the University of New Haven and the English and the Communications Department. See you next time.